A quick Google search of the history of Air Zimbabwe reveals that the airline was established in 1967. But is that the whole story? Let's find out. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is Marston, the Zim Tech guy. And as usual, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. And if you do eventually end up liking the video, please hit the thumbs up button. If you love the content of this channel, please consider partnering with me on Patreon, link in the description. For us to understand the history of aviation in Zimbabwe, we have to go back to the year 1920, when the first aircraft landed on the then Rhodesian soil. The trailblazing Vickers Vimy Silver Queen II, flown by Van Ryneveld and Brand with two mechanics, arrived in Bulawayo on the 5th of March 1920 after an epic flight across Europe down Africa. This obviously left some of the white settlers inspired, because roughly a month later, on the 8th of April, Rhodesia's first enterprise to concern itself with aviation, Airroad Motors, was registered but never acquired any aircraft or other vehicles. It went into liquidation after a few months. But that is not to say that they did not carry out any aviation-related business. During its brief existence, the company acted as agents for the visiting Barnstormer pilots, Thompson and Rutherford, who toured southern and northern Rhodesia during the period of 23 May to the 8th of October 1920, and whose Avro 544 Cape aeroplane named Rhodesia was the first ever seen by thousands of Rhodesians, and hundreds actually got to fly in an airplane for the first time in their lives. In 1922, Rhodesia's first operational air company, Rhodesia Airroad Tours, was established at Bulawayo by the pioneer South African airman Major A.M. Miller. The company operated a single aircraft, an Avro named Matebele, but after 2 months, the plane sustained moderate damage while attempting to take off from an improvised landing ground at Rusape. The machine was never repaired, and the company went into liquidation soon afterwards. For the next few years, not much was happening in the Rhodesian airspace, except for a few planes which passed through Bulawayo in transit to various destinations in the region. Then in January 1926, Sir Alan Cobham, flying a DH-50 aeroplane, spent a few days at Bulawayo in the course of an air route survey which he was conducting on behalf of Imperial Airways Limited. In the early part of the following year, Captain J. Douglas Mayo came to Bulawayo from Natal, South Africa, to join Mr. B.M. Kane's Motor and Cycle Supply Company. Douglas Mayo brought with him by rail a war surplus, a DH-6B aircraft, which he had been operating in Natal, which he spent the next couple of weeks unpacking and assembling at the home of Mr. Aston Redrap, another enthusiast for aviation. In August 1927, the Rhodesian Aviation Syndicate was formed, chiefly financed by Mr. Harry L. Stewart, a Philabusi miner and rancher. Other members of the company included Mr. A. H. Hay, Captain J. D. Mell, and Mr. A. S. Redrap as secretary. Mr. John Coghlan was acting in a legal capacity. The three-seater aeroplane was property of Captain Mayo. On the 16th of August, the Bulawayo Chronicle reported that DH-6B named Baby Tank took off from the racecourse on its first flight in Rhodesia soon after 4 p.m. on Sunday, the 14th of August. 5 weeks later, the Syndicate received a cable from the aircraft's manufacturer, the Havilands of England, which read, "Congratulations on getting the DH-6 into the air. Must be only about 4 left in the world." But that compliment did not stand the test of time. On Tuesday, the 20th of September, the aircraft was chartered by Dak Denemo to fly to a village of Plumtree, some 60 statute air miles southwest of Bulawayo, where Dak was to dine that evening with Mr. Hammond, headmaster of Plumtree School. Captain Mayo and his passenger took off from Bulawayo Racecourse in the DH-6 at 4:30 p.m. But when less than 10 miles out, they were forced, due to loss of engine power, to land in a clearing. One of the aircraft's wings sustained slight damage, and they had to walk back some miles to Bellevue suburb. The damaged aircraft was transported back to Bulawayo, where it was stored at the drill hole, pending repairs. But it never flew again, and it seems to be generally accepted that the machine was underpowered for successful operation in Bulawayo, which stands at an average elevation of 4,500 feet above sea level. Mr. A.G. Hay one of the Syndicate's founders, was in London at the time. The Syndicate cabled him requesting that he order a Moth aircraft from de Havilands to replace the DH-6, and it was arranged that the Syndicate would become agents for de Havilland Company in southern and northern Rhodesia. This was reported to be the first de Havilland's franchise in Southern Africa. While in London, Mr. Hay took the opportunity to interview Sir Henry Berchenough, the Duke of Abercorn, and Sir Otto Bate, directors of the chartered company, regarding what was termed flying prospects in Rhodesia, but they did not fly with the idea. Then on the 12th of October, the Bulawayo Chronicle reported, new aviation company, the Rhodesian Aviation Company Limited, has been established. The resolution was adopted that a limited liability company be formed to carry out aviation in all its branches in Southern Rhodesia, Northern Rhodesia, and the Union of South Africa and elsewhere. Soon afterwards, it was announced that negotiations were in progress with the government of Southern Rhodesia with a view of the establishment of air services connecting Bulawayo to Fort Victoria, modern-day Masvingo, Lonely Mine, Johannesburg, and also services between Salisbury and Fort Victoria and between Umtali and Melseta. But these plans did not materialize. The projected company did not come into being until nearly 2 years later, then in a much modified form. The Moth aircraft ordered by Mr. Hay was shipped to Durban and flown from there to Bulawayo by Captain Mayo, arriving on the 30th of December. Later, it was given the name Bulawayo. A month later, on the 12th of February, Captain Mayo flew the Moth to Salisbury, where he made some local sightseeing flights and gave a display of aerobatics, possibly the first ever seen by residents of the capital. At the end of February, Douglas Mayo left the Rhodesian Aviation Syndicate and joined the aircraft operating company, which has secured the contract for an extensive aerial photographic survey in the western province of Northern Rhodesia, which is now Zambia. Captain Mayo's post in the Rhodesian Aviation Syndicate was filled by a pilot named Wright. On the 4th of March, he took off from Bulawayo in the Moth with Major Newman as a passenger, bound for Salisbury. Shortly after taking off, the aircraft hit a tree and crashed in a thick bush half a mile beyond the New Milton School. Neither pilot nor passenger sustained injury, but the machine was wrecked and the Syndicate was now without an aircraft and a pilot. After the ordeal, Mr. Rife was apparently never heard from again in Rhodesian aviation circles. You're probably going like, dude, we came here for the history of Air Zimbabwe. What's all this? Bear with me. Now, during the third week of March, Sir Alan Cobham visited the Rhodesias for discussions with the respective governments in connection with the Trans-Africa Air Route in which the United Kingdom government was interested. But these talks did not appear to have produced any noticeable results. Thereafter, matters remained static for some months. Towards the end of December 1928, Mr. F. Isles, chairman of the Rhodesian Aviation Syndicate, who had just returned from a visit to the United Kingdom, summarized the situation in these words. Aviation in Rhodesia is marking time, he added. However, the Cobham and Blackburn Company have promised to send us an aeroplane. This company, whose principals were Sir Alan Cobham and Mr. Robert Blackburn of the Blackburn Aeroplane and Motor Company, planned eventually to operate a chain of air services linking Cairo with Cape Town. The Rhodesian Aviation Syndicate was later absorbed by the Rhodesian Aviation Company, which was to be affiliated with Cobham and Blackburn Airlines, with the latter having a large interest in the Rhodesian Aviation Company. Cobham and Blackburn appointed Captain Benjamin Roxburgh Smith as their representative in the Rhodesian Aviation Company because of the aeronautical experience and his knowledge of conditions in Africa. He became the pilot for the company as well. In February 1929, Captain Roxburgh Smith returned to Bulawayo and was able to raise sufficient local capital to launch the Rhodesian Aviation Company, with, as agreed, the backing of Cobham and Blackburn Airlines. It was agreed that Cobham and Blackburn Airlines were to provide Blackburn Bluebird aircraft, a single-engined, two-seater, open-cockpit biplane, in return for its value in shares in the new company. The company was formally registered on the 17th of April 1929, but owing to a serious delay in the delivery of the Bluebird, the commencement of flying operations was postponed. Early in June, since there was still no sign of the promised Bluebird, a considerable amount of potential business was being lost. A second-hand Avro avian aircraft was purchased from the Johannesburg Light Plane Club. This machine arrived in Bulawayo on the 13th of June and was immediately flown up to Livingstone, where it was put to work operating flips over the Victoria Falls. Early in November, Captain Roxburgh Smith collected a second Avro avian from Johannesburg. On the delivery flight, he was accompanied by young DS Pat Judson, the son of Colonel Dan Judson, who had recently qualified for his commercial flying license and who now joined the company as assistant pilot. Sir Alan Cobham visited Bulawayo early in January 1930 and on the 8th held a meeting with the directors of the Rhodesian Aviation Company, no doubt to consolidate the arrangements which had been tentatively agreed. A month later, Captain Roxburgh Smith travelled by rail to Cape Town to collect the long-awaited Bluebird, which had arrived there by sea, and flew it up to Bulawayo, which he reached on the 15th of February 1930. At Bulawayo's altitude, its performance was disappointing, and it did not prove to be a popular aeroplane. It was announced that the Rhodesian Aviation Company was to act as a feeder to Imperial Airways for the planned Cape to Cairo service, since Cobham and Blackburn Airlines held a large interest in the company and acted as the technical advisors and provided equipment and personnel. Early in 1931, Imperial Airways Limited took over the African interests of Cobham and Blackburn Airlines, including the company's shares in the Rhodesian Aviation Syndicate and their Cyrus moth aeroplane at Bulawayo. They promptly withdrew all financial support of the Rhodesian Aviation Company, maintaining that until the main air route through Africa was established, no assistance to subsidiary companies would be forthcoming. Aviation in southern Rhodesia seemed to have plateaued for some time. Then came the news that a well-known British naval officer, racing motorist and airman, Glenn Kidston, who inherited a very large fortune, had business interests in South Africa, wanted to pay a flying visit to Southern Africa to investigate the possibility of commercial air services in South Africa. It was also reported that he hoped to purchase a controlling interest in Union Airways, a predecessor to the South African Airways, which was then a private company managed by Major A.M. Miller. Kidston left the United Kingdom in his Lockheed Vega aircraft on the 31st of March and arrived in Rhodesia on the 4th of April. After a brief stop at Salisbury to refuel the machine, he spent the night at Bulawayo, promising to return within a week or two to discuss future plans concerning aviation. He landed at Cape Town on the 6th of April, having set a new record for the UK and Cape Town flight. Kidston was joined in Cape Town by another air pioneer, Captain A. Gladstone, who had devoted many years of his life to the development of the Trans-Africa air route and had been in charge of Cobham and Blackburn Airlines air services between Cairo and Kisumu in 1927. When the airline was absorbed by Imperial Airways, it seems that he threw his lot with Kidston and was now described as his business manager. Not long after Kidston's brief stopover in Bulawayo, Captain Roxburgh Smith announced his resignation from the Rhodesian Aviation Company to take effect in May. His decision taken at this juncture may have been coincidental, but it seems likely that it was in some way influenced by Imperial Airways' takeover of Cobham and Blackburn Airlines, since he was their representative in the local company, and by developments planned by Kidston, who undoubtedly would have been on the lookout for men with flying and managerial experience of Roxburgh and Smith's caliber. But Kidston was never to return to Bulawayo. Whilst in South Africa, Kidston decided that his Lockheed aircraft was unsuitable for operation from some of the unsophisticated landing grounds on his itinerary, so he borrowed a DH Moth, a much lighter machine, from Glenn Bateman of Johannesburg. At mid-morning on the 5th of May, Kidston and Gladstone left Johannesburg for Pietermaritzburg on the first sector of their tour, and later that day came the stunning news that the aircraft had crashed while crossing the Drakensberg Mountains on the Orange Free State and Natal border, and that both men were dead. Many believe that if Kidston's plans had materialized, aviation in Southern Africa would have taken a different turn. Back in Rhodesia, on the 1st of June, Mr. Pat Judson, Esquire assistant pilot, took over as flying manager of the Rhodesian Aviation Company. Captain Roxburgh Smith, since any ambitions which he might have cherished regarding the Keystone enterprise would have been dashed by the latter's untimely death, returned to England. The Rhodesian Aviation Company was now relying on the Southern Rhodesian government and the Bate Trust for subsidies in order to stay afloat. The company managed to purchase a 1932 Puss moth cabin aeroplane after selling off some of its unallocated shares. More bad news would come on Friday the 20th of November 1931, when Pat Judson and his flying pupil Jock Speight lost their lives in a training accident at Salisbury while flying the above-mentioned Moth. This is the same plane that Keystone had died in, and other problems with the planes had been reported globally. Then, aviation in southern Rhodesia took a positive turn on the 10th of February when Sir Alfred Bate, one of the Bate trustees and the director of Rhodesia Railways, announced that the Bate Trust had made a grant of £50,000 for facilitating air transport in southern Rhodesia and northern Rhodesia on the Imperial route. The Imperial route through north and southern Rhodesia at that time was Mbeya, Mpika, Broken Hill, Salisbury, Bulawayo, and Petersburg. The Bate trustees decided that in order to ensure that the monies were put to the most advantageous use, a competent authority should be consulted. And on the 18th of April, it was learned that Mr. H.N. Norman, a director of Airwork Limited and Aerofilms Limited, both British companies, had been appointed technical advisor on aviation to the trustees. He was to visit Africa and thereafter would prepare a report upon aeronautical conditions in North and Southern Rhodesia. During this time, Colonel Dan Judson made a generous offer to take up additional block of shares with money accruing from a policy of his late son's life. A month or two later, the company ordered a DH Foxmoth, with which was to operate a new weekly service for the route Salisbury, Bulawayo, and Johannesburg. The new aeroplane was delivered in mid-May and the first service was flown on the 27th, the pilot being Mr. M.H. Pierce, who had joined the company as a second pilot after the death of Pat Judson. Mr. Norman, the Bate Trust's technical advisor on aviation, after returning to the United Kingdom, prepared a most comprehensive and cogent paper generally referred to as the Nigel Norman Report. This was submitted in mid-1933 with recommendations after surveying the whole of the Imperial Airways route from Cairo to Cape Town and also subsidiary routes extending from the colonies to Nyasaland, Portuguese East Africa and the Belgian Congo. Mr. Norman's recommendations included the construction of additional aerodromes, landing grounds and provision of a government-operated light aircraft to supervise their maintenance, provision of aviation maps, pilot handbooks, establishment of additional meteorological and wireless stations, provision of night flying equipment at the main aerodromes and en route flashing beacons between Salisbury and the Limpopo River. Pretty much most of the aviation-related guidelines on the continent was as a result of this report. The report included various detailed maps, sketches and landing grounds and aerial photographs taken by himself of several aerodromes. Concluding his report, Mr. Norman recommended the establishment of a properly constituted aviation company to operate feeder services, etc. in Southern Rhodesia, Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland. Perhaps one of the most important recommendations by Norman was to obtain for the company the permanent backing of all governments concerned and the whole of financial aid available in the form of subsidies. There can be no doubt whatsoever that serious note was taken of Mr. Nigel Norman's recommendations. For on the 4th of August 1933, a meeting of Rhodesian Aviation Company shareholders was held in Bulawayo. Mr. Cecil Roberts, a director, took the chair in the absence of the company's chairman, Mr. F. Issos. Mr. Roberts told the assembly that the company's affairs were to be handed over to a new company, whose capital would be subscribed chiefly by the Bate trustees, which body would have a controlling interest. Imperial Airways would subscribe a lesser amount and would be technical advisors, while the Rhodesian Railways would have the option of taking a certain number of shares. The chairman of the new company would be Sir Henry Chapman, a general manager of the Rhodesian Railways. Capital would be £25,000 in £1 shares, and the name of the new company would be the Rhodesian and Nyasaland Airways, This would commonly be abbreviated to as RANA. The Rhodesian and Nyasaland Airways was incorporated at Bulawayo on the 12th of October 1933. The new company included in itself the old Rhodesian Aviation Company, which then went into voluntary liquidation. RANA later on introduced the Midland service for Salisbury, Kadoma, Kwekwe, Gweru, and Bulawayo. Bulawayo had been the hub of Rhodesian aviation, but it was now anticipated that Salisbury would become an important air center owing to its favorable geographical position. For a few months, the headquarters of the new airline remained at the railway offices in Bulawayo. Then in early 1934, all control, as predicted, moved to Salisbury. The aircraft taken over from the old companies formed the nucleus of RANA's fleet, and in mid-February 1934, two more puss moths 47 were acquired when Christovitz Air Services of Blantyre was absorbed into the new enterprise. In order to place a multi-engine airplane on the routes without delay, a westlad Wessex machine was obtained on loan from Imperial Airways pending delivery of a twin-engine DH-89 Dragon Rapid which had been ordered. The Wessex was a somewhat unwieldy-looking three-engine monoplane, the first multi-engine public transport aircraft to operate from a base in Central Africa. In January 1937, Captain Charles A. Barnard succeeded Captain Thompson as operations manager, and in June, RANA received a tremendous boost when Imperial Airways discontinued using the Atlanta-class aircraft over the Central African route and commenced operating short C-class flying boats on the East Coast route. This coincided with the introduction of the Empire Air Mail scheme, whereby all first-class mail on Empire routes was carried wherever possible by air, unsurcharged. Imperial Airways was appointed contractor to the British government and RANA subcontractor to the former airline. During the first 4 years of operation, RANA was subsidized by Rhodesia's Bay Trust to a total of £19,000. But after the introduction of the Empire Airmail scheme, it became, for the first time in Rhodesia's history, a viable airline. By September 1939, when World War II commenced, RANA's fleet had been built to a total of 9 aircraft, 5 DH-89 Dragon Rapids, a DH-84 Dragon, and 3 DH-85 Leopard moths. On the 1st of February 1940, the assets of RANA, together with many of the ground and flying staff, were taken over by the government of Southern Rhodesia and formed into a combined communications squadron and airline, the latter being named Southern Rhodesian Air Services. RANA, at the government's request, remained dormant on the files of the Registrar of Companies in order that, at the termination of hostilities, normal operations might be resumed. This, however, was not to be. In 1945, it was decided that the interests of civil aviation in Central Africa would be best served by an airways corporation backed by the governments of the 3 territories, then known as Southern Rhodesia, Northern Rhodesia, and Nyasaland. The Central African Airways Corporation came into being on the 1st of June 1946, and RANA went into voluntary liquidation on the 8th of July 1946. Air Vice Marshal Sir Charles Warburton Meredith served as founding chairman, overseeing an initial fleet of de Havilland Dragon Rapids, 5 Avro Ansons, 1 de Havilland Tiger Moth, 1 de Havilland Leopard Moth, all of which had previously been operated by the respective air forces. Originally, the airline was headquartered at Belvedere Airport, now demolished, serving Salisbury. Between 1948 and 1949, 2 Bristol freighters joined the fleet. To get a larger and more modern aircraft, the Central African Airways purchased 3 Vickers VC Viking and 5 de Havilland Dove, the first of which were delivered in 1947. The Vikings formed the backbone for mainline passenger flights until their withdrawal from service in 1958. Most notably, since 1953, the colonial coach service linking Salisbury, Ndola, and Lusaka with London. The Doves were intended to be used for so-called bush flights to poorly prepared landing strips, but proved unsuitable for the prevailing hot and high conditions. Therefore, in 1951 onwards, they were replaced by de Havilland Beavers, which had the desired capabilities. Under the leadership of Sir Ellis Robbins, who had taken over as chairman in 1947. Another modernization took place when the Vickers Viscount were introduced with Central African Airways on the 25th of April 1956 with a seating capacity of 52. This was a significantly higher capacity than the 24-passenger of a Viking. The territories of Southern and Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland merged into one country known as the Central African Federation. You can watch my video on that, I'll leave a card above. In 1956, Salisbury Airport, which is now the Robert Mugabe International Airport, was opened, and the Central African Airlines moved its hub and headquarters to the new facilities. The new airport attracted foreign airlines, most notably South African Airways, so that for the first time, Central African Airways experienced competitors on its international routes. As a result, the financial situation worsened. No further growth of the route network occurred over the following years. With the Douglas C-47 Dakota, another aircraft type was introduced, which allowed both passenger and cargo flights. During the 1960s, the Central African Airways ordered two BAC-111-207 aircraft, but delivery was blocked by the United Nations because of sanctions following the unilateral Declaration of Independence by Ian Smith. I'll leave a card above to that video. And one Douglas DC-6, which was leased from Alitalia between 1962 and 1965. In the wake of the decolonization of Africa and the African independence movement, the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland was dissolved on the 31st of December 1963. In 1964, the independent states of Zambia and Malawi were proclaimed in northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland. To recognize this move, Zambia Airways and Air Malawi were founded as wholly owned subsidiaries of the Central African Airways, taking over the route network in their respective countries. In 1965, Air Rhodesia was founded as the third Central African Airways subsidiary. Thenceforth, only the prestigious international flights from Salisbury to London and Johannesburg were operated under the Central African Airways brand. In 1967, Zambia Airways, Air Malawi, and Air Rhodesia decided to become independent of each other, and the Central African Airways was disestablished. The Air Rhodesia Corporation was created by the Southern Rhodesian government on the 1st of September 1967. Following the dissolution of the Central African Airways Corporation, at the end of 1967, Air Rhodesia inherited the Central African Airways Corporation's operations as well as the fleet of Boeing, DC-3 and Viscount aircraft. In 1978, it was briefly renamed to Air Zimbabwe Rhodesia, owing to political events in the nation. And finally, Air Zimbabwe in April 1980, when the Republic of Zimbabwe was formed. That is the history of Air Zimbabwe. Now, for events after independence, there's a lot of news of that on the internet. Like if you enjoyed the video and leave a comment down below. See you in the next video.